Betsy and Thomas here for the American Intelligence Media, and we have Michael McKibben of Leader Technologies.
Hello there. Glad to be here.
The reason that we ask you to be here is to kick off May, because May is Serco Awareness Month. Last month was Senior Executive Service Month.
I did know something about that.
Yes, you did, because you made a major contribution to the awareness worldwide of just who these people are in the shadow government deep state. Can you tell folks about the research tool you developed to go through the plum books?
Well, we started looking at Senior Executive Service because of a file that actually you sent us, where it was a very broken government document that had a list of people in it, and it was describing this group called the Senior Executive Service, which I had never heard of. And I asked my friends, and they never heard of it. And so I made some calls around the country, and they hadn't heard of it. And I said, what is this group? And so we started digging into that file and realized that this was a motherlode of names of people involved with, our gut was this was a deep state document. And as is typical with a lot of these government disclosures, where the people who say they're government officials, sometimes they have these transparency requirements where they have to make lists of things and make reports. And so this was one of those documents. So as we started digging into it, we found it wasn't searchable. You couldn't index it. You couldn't really do much with it. And so that was also very suspicious. So we put a team of engineers on breaking out this document and making it searchable. And then we said, where are the rest of these documents? And I can't remember what year that was reporting for, but that exploded into weeks of work to dig into these documents, and we found them completely obscured from public view, even though if you actually went to the site, you could actually see the document on the screen. But as soon as you try to save it or search it or cut and paste it, everything broke.
I mean, it's very clear they were hiding in digital space to keep their big secret a secret. And the other thing is that, and I'll have a link below, people can continue to use this research tool. You have it on your site.
It's at Americans for Innovation, and yes. I think you have a link to it as well.
No, I'll have it in the description box. But what I wanted to point out is, if you don't find a name in there, it doesn't mean that they aren't part of this. Can you explain that?
Correct. Well, there's several games that these disclosures play. And one is, if you see a reference in these documents to DO, that means that the person was disclosed in a previous plum book. These are called plum book documents. And so even though the person's name may not be in that category, they may have been listed in a previous plum book 4 years earlier or 8 years earlier or 12 years earlier. And so it is a real document chase to try to find names. So that is one of the tricks. And the other one is there are names missing, obviously, because the disclosure says there are other people involved and other categories involved and special categories and things like this that aren't disclosed in this plum book. So there are obviously names that they didn't disclose.
And they're only printed every 4 years. It seems kind of odd. So we'll have a new one, not until, 2020? I think the last one was 2016.
It'll be every change of a president, they publish it right before the new president comes into power.
Okay. So last month we got everybody aware of Senior Executive Service, and the reason is that it's a good next step to take when you try to understand what this thing is called Serco, and so people know you're here, Douglas.
Well, it's, the SES, you might as well take the E out of the middle. It is basically a corporate SS, a terrorist takeover of the civil service. It's a parasite. It's a parasitical organism that has copied the ancient systems that were used both with the Crown and in the City of London and with the Pope. So once you realize that these are the people who control all of the contracts, they're the people who stand in the way of even presidential appointees doing their job, they're the people who always remain, they're the status quo, bureaucratic, career politicians who are unelected, and in most cases of the 10,000 we were looking at, 8,000 or 9,000 of them were appointed by Obama. He did some real tricky footwork to make sure that happened before he left office, and even set up this concept that the senior executives that control all agencies in the federal government have to move from job to job. And they are not qualified for any of the jobs in many cases that they are, in fact, supposedly in charge of. They're not trained in it. And because they're moving all the time, you have to ask the question, then what good are they? What do they do? And it took a while for us to find the Senior Executive Association, but basically it's a union. And these people all are told how to march together at the same time, at the same direction, with the same purpose. And the same purpose is to work for companies that are the same old status quo, make sure that money flows to them with either no-bid contracts or back and forth between which company they choose. And so let's say one time they choose Serco, the next time they choose CACI, same company. Next time they choose SI International, same company. Next time they choose, and you look and you look and you look, you can't find how big the web of these corporate groups like Serco are. But who do they answer to? The Senior Executive Service, who are basically the bureaucratic federal government that makes sure that we stay in corporate alignment with the British Crown and other organizations that have their hands out for this money.
And that's why we want to focus on Serco this month, because Serco is really the group that is running our government. We've turned, the SES employees have turned over the running of our government to this Serco, and it's not just here in the United States. I'm hearing from folks from Brazil, Europe, and Michael,
Right.
Can you speak to that? They're all over.
They're all over. It's mostly Serco is focused on the U.S., England, Australia, Canada, the Five Eyes countries. That's where you can see their activity big time. And then they are all spread out other places as well, but that's where they're focused.
And they didn't just happen overnight. The research that the conclave is doing now shows that this has always been with us, and there is a real question of whether we indeed won the Revolutionary War.
Right. Yeah.
And the question is we'll be answering here in a moment is, what does Serco have to do with the Patent Office? But first, let's look into the fact that Serco runs just about everything you can imagine. Data management for both the top secret, secure military at all levels, all municipalities, cities, bus services. They run the airports. They run the airport services. They run
some of our prisons.
Immigration.
Military training.
You can't name all the different things they serve, and those are the ones just under the umbrella of Serco.
Oh, did we mention Obamacare?
Well, yes, Obamacare, $2 billion over time. I think they paid them. Well, actually, $2 billion to CGI to begin to just set up the site, and then I think it was a $1.2 billion contract over 5 years, which continued. So yes, these people in Serco somehow always get the premier contracts, and if you look closely, they may be founded in America, but the question would be, do they really pay taxes here, and or who is standing behind them? And Michael, you and your amazing researchers have found out that there's people standing behind Serco. Let me just first frame this. An old monopoly called RCA, which those of us my age remember, RCA and RCA Victrola, was taken over by General Electric, and then it was taken over again by RCA, and then it was taken over again by General Electric, and then they started to phase out, and they bought up all the intelligence groups and all of the high-tech groups, a couple dozen of them, and a group called CACI, which had bought all these groups, was then bought out by GE. And then another group that was handling data management, SI International, and another one, they bought those out and they absorbed them into GE. And then what did they do? They sold it to the Crown. They sold it to Britain.
Right.
Very sneaky way. Can you explain how they did that so that nobody had to question, what it was they were doing?
As is typical with these companies, they have very convoluted structures where something starts over here, then after a few years it sells out to somebody over there, and then they merge back, and then they reform the names, and so it's all very, very confusing. And it's obviously meant to keep people out and to not understanding what they're doing. But with Serco in the U.S., it's more simple because in 1999, a former Lockheed executive, no, actually he was still a current Lockheed executive, the head of the Washington technology branch for Lockheed, formed this company with a number of other people, including many CACI alums, called SI International, and they started it in Chicago, and it was funded with Chicago venture capital money, part of it from Bain Capital, Mitt Romney's outfit. And so they started acquiring government contracts. I'm talking about top secret government contracts at a feverish pace. I mean, we're talking 50, 100 million. I mean, these guys were either insiders or they were brilliant salesmen. And I don't think it was the second. And so they started developing contracts, and they started growing by $50, $100 million a year. And then in 2006, I believe, they sold, no, it was 2008, they sold to Serco Group PLC, which is the British parent of all these Serco companies. So at that point, the British parent bought into all of our military and defense work in the U.S. by way of this company that Lockheed had formed previously. So as you can see, it seems that all paths lead back to Lockheed. And so from 2008, basically many aspects of our government that we interact with on a daily basis is run by this British company.
Well, can we go back to this notion that we never won the American Revolution because we've had these crown agents and British forces just collecting their tolls and they collect money from us every step of the way that we're being taxed. Can you say something?
Well, you
about
mentioned. Why don't you start with the Tea Party, because I think that's a fascinating one for people, that the crown agents were involved in the Tea Party.
Oh, you mean the Boston Tea Party?
that?
Yes.
Yeah, the original Tea Party.
Oh, well, that was actually the British East India Company had brought stale tea that they wouldn't be accepted in Britain, so they brought it to the colonies, and it was just part of their taxation plan. One of the many things that the British East India Company did, which was ruthless because they had a monopoly, it was a ruthless monopoly, and they wanted gold. And so there was already a colonial script in America, and they wanted to stop that. So when it comes down to it, what you're really talking about is a battle of the banks in the early days. Remember that the German trade warriors, we'll call them, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, those are the first charters, but they were backed by banks. And these banks were the bankers who basically invested in war. And because the Pope believed that the Pope could just say, all this land west of here I own, and I'm splitting it up between these countries. People believed that, and they went off and did that, and they chartered. So the the Crown of England chartered the Virginia Company and many other colonies, and they basically, if you look at the charters, they go back to the City of London and the Bar Association, and it goes back to the original lawyers who were the ones setting these things up. Now, lawyers to begin with had to be landed gentry. That's the reason, even to this day, in every bar association in America, they become esquires when they take the vow to the bar. And the vow to the bar is the vow to the Crown Temple Church or the Crown Temple Bar. It's the same thing. And in the same spot, literally through the Hospitallers, the Templars on one side with law and the Hospitallers on the other side with banks, those same German and Dutch bankers came to England, and in the City of London, they set up the banks, which then they sent their agents to America. For example, Alexander Hamilton, everybody thinks he's a nice guy. His name was really Alexander Levine. He was a Jewish clerk for the Rothschilds Bank. Morgan was a clerk for the Rothschilds Bank. Warburg was a clerk for the Rothschilds Bank. And those are the people who set up the Federal Reserve and the central banks.
Can I stop you there a second, Douglas? Because one of the things that is starting to make sense for me as I'm putting together the pieces for myself is to realize that most of us who have been raised in America, in our educational system, this part of our history was just completely absent our studies, and so we never really understood how America developed. And one of the things that makes sense for me is to realize that when we sent the British Army packing, the next day everybody in America had to get up and go to work, and so they were all doing various types of industries. They were buying and selling. They were trading internationally and nationally, and so life went on. And so what I think the biggest realization I have is that the the British left militarily, but what we never did was never disengaged from the business of Europe, and therefore the business of Britain. And there were still loans, bank loans. What did we do with all those? We didn't just wipe them out. They all got transitioned. And so to me, that was the foothold that the banking system that you're talking about got early on in our republic and has never left.
Well, now that we know and we can see in current events how fake news works, and we know about propaganda, certainly our history books have been nothing but propaganda.
Right.
I keep looking back at the Tavistock Institute that is located in England as being a source of where we have all been propagandized. Our school system, the books, you can't get a textbook written without the approval of a big publisher who's owned by the cabal. So, of course, and it's going to be a rude awakening for Americans to realize that we are not what we think we are. But it's not too late. We can actually use that momentum to change it. What are some of the things that we could do, Douglas, to start making changes here in America?
Oh, well, we have many people who approach that concept, and one of the ones that we were getting ready to have a chat with probably wrote these protocols. In other words, like their own memorandum or their own manifesto of what it is that needs to come to consciousness, and then the foundation of that you can build on. And that's what we're trying to do with so many of our articles, especially these ebooks, these ebook series we're working on right now. We've told you about some of these things from the far past, from the time of the Crusades, and we've told you about the way it works in today's world. It's the same thing. These are the same warlord bankers and brokers who are on both sides of all wars. And they actually then charge interest on the debt of that war and then enslave the country that they started the war in there to begin with. And how do they do that? Well, the Rothschilds used what's called Reuters. Reuters, Thomson was Reuters, and it was owned by the Rothschilds, and that was their propaganda network. And through that, they could actually manipulate people, manipulate markets, and even create wars, even create fake wars. True yellow journalism started with Reuters and Rothschilds. And then in America, it was the Associated Press, which was owned at one point by Rothschild. So if you have the press, and if you write the textbooks, as you pointed out, Betsy, then you can change people's consciousness so that they're in a malaise. They can't see anything.
Well, we just never know. Like Michael brings up a very good point. That part of American history is kind of glossed over. We never really deep dive into who these characters were.
Right.
If I may say, I have a degree in this. I happen to have a bachelor's of art in history with a focus in British history. And I can tell you, first off, that the Queen of England is not even British, and so everything is not the way that it appears.
Wait. She's not British?
No, she's
I think she's British.
Nope, she's German.
German.
What is it? The Saxe-Coburg, Hesse. She's basically a German descent.
They're related to,
she's a German descent.
royalty.
They took on the name Windsor as just a way to look more British. But the point is that the back and forth between France, Germany, and Anglos, the Saxons, the whole mess, well, those aren't the Celts. Those are the remnants of the Celts. So who's who? It doesn't matter.
Okay, so simple question.
Who runs the banks?
Simple question. Matters. You said she's German. How did Britain get in a war with Hitler then?
That was an accident. They never meant to. It was because of Winston Churchill didn't really fully understand what was going on. He was painted to be the hero. He wasn't on board with the plans of even the ex-monarch who had stepped down and become a Nazi. And the king, had stepped down and become a Nazi, point blank. That's a historical fact. And it was supposed to be an inside banking deal. Remember, it was the Brits and Prescott Bush through his bank, Union Bank, which handled the basically militarizing and being the credit behind militarizing Hitler. It was George
Bush's granddad?
Yes, Prescott Bush and Union Bank, which was actually tried and closed down because of their association with the enemy, Trading with the Enemy Act. So these things, we don't know these things. And so when you hear them, it's a shock. So we're trying to give some history in some of these stories that we've been doing of recent. We've gone out and we found people who tell the story pretty well. Like one of the ones we recently released was Judge Dale.
And I'll put the link in the description box.
And it talked about all the different acts that happened to enslave Americans. We talk about the same thing. We talk about the 12 steps of the overthrow of the Republic starting in 1913. Now we go back and we say it was probably when Washington, D.C. was founded. It's probably more accurate, and then there's a debate on exactly what date that would be, so I'm not going to quote a date. But from the founding of the district of the Washington, D.C., which is separate from all the states, that is when it started, and with 1913 and the founding of the Fed, and also the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations, the United Nations, and all that came from that, and the International Monetary Fund, all those things took the IRS, the laws that created the Internal Revenue Service, the law that created Social Security. These laws are all unconstitutional. These are federal control of states' rights.
Right.
And that isn't what's supposed to happen. The individual is supposed to have sovereignty and have the rights. The states have powers, and the federal government supports them. They actually have no power. The federal government is only there to be the go-between between all the states for creating treaties and creating, this and that.
Well, what we want to do with this is just to let folks know that this is Serco. May is Serco Awareness Month, and we'd like you to be pushing out articles and videos, creating new content to help educate your own audiences about Serco. When you do produce material, if you could send it to the American Intelligence Media. We love to share independent media creators' works with other people in our space. We also urge people all around the world to do the same activity, with the purpose being, after the month, if you go to the internet and you type in Serco, that for the first 2 pages you get plenty of material on Serco. Michael, can you wrap this up for us?
Yeah, one of the things that I think we need to do is we need to do a relationship map for Serco, all the Serco subsidiary companies all around the planet, and we need to specifically identify the ownership structures of each of these subsidiaries and how they roll up to Serco Group PLC, which is run by Sir Roy Gardner.
Okay.
And OBE, what's his name, Rupert Soames. Those are the Queen's 2 key. One's the CEO, the other's the chairman. And so what we need to do is we all need to get out there and find all these Serco companies and let's create a master map so we can see this.
Because you can't defeat the enemy if you don't know who the enemy is.
Right.
And this is a worldwide movement. People all over the world are sick and tired of the control that these elites have had over us.
As I've worked in business, one of the things I always got frustrated by in dealing with large companies is the way that every time you try to talk to them or sell to them or anything else, everything just is a load of mush because you never get straight answers about anything. Now I can realize now that these companies like Serco, like the SES, are sitting there in the background basically acting like little gods, and they're deciding who is going to be blessed by them and who isn't going to be blessed by them. It's not competition. This is all insider trading. It's just on a very large scale. So what we need to do is identify the components of this insider trading.
And these are monopolies. And in England alone, $80 billion in fraud through Serco's services, which only get a 65% efficiency rating overall in the studies that they've done. That's just one country. It reaches into New Zealand, Australia, America, Canada, and then all over the world. And what's beautiful about what Betsy was saying is, in the months that we focus on something, like in the month we focused on SES, people sent us in amazing things we didn't know. And then we researched it and we found out astounding new things. So we want to thank all of the listeners and the subscribers and the people who support us and send in this information for us to comb through so that we can get you the indictable evidence that we need to show that every person in SES knows when they take on that job that they believe they are above every civil servant in America. For that reason alone, we need to say goodbye to SES. And when we expose Serco for the rest of this month, at the end, what we want people to do is say, why can't we hire Americans? We really don't need to enrich
Absolutely.
the United Kingdom.